Johnny Tapia. You wrote a book, The Ghost of Johnny Tapia, with his wife, Teresa. You heard firsthand her stories from Johnny. I've interviewed her as well. As you know, you helped out with that, and some of her stories of Johnny are crazy. Johnny certainly had a roller coaster life. Um, Johnny is a man who needed boxing. Boxing is what kept him alive at some times of his life. Talk to me about Johnny Tapia. And again, I'll start with the same question as the last episode. What shocked you the most when doing the research with Johnny Tapia?
I think it was before he started boxing, to be honest. I mean, his dad was murdered when his mum was pregnant with him, and then there's a book called Mi Vida Loca, which is fantastic. Sadly, the author, she died. The ghostwriter, she died, I think, during COVID times a couple of years ago. Bettina something or other. Um, so I was very lucky to have interviewed Teresa back in about 2017, I think it was, and we had a bit of a chit chat. And roughly around the same time, I was working for Hannibal Boxing, and they had Hamilcar Books, and they said, "Can you think of anyone who's had a really dark story?" And I was thinking, "Oh bloody hell, Johnny Tapia! You're not going to get any darker than that. That's pretty much lights out in a room style darkness." So I spoke with Teresa, and she said, "Yeah, I'm up for this." So the great thing about working with Teresa is that she was able to shine a torch into a lot of dark corners that previously hadn't been addressed. When I read Mi Vida Loca, I knew there was lots of stuff missing out from there. And one of the most poignant tales, or how can I put it, softened down tales that was in that book was how Teresa first met Johnny. And this was probably for me one of the most shocking things. They met at a barbecue. She was underage in terms of drinking, so I think she was 20. And he'd gone over there and said, I'm going to marry you. And she was just thinking, who is this crazy little man? So anyway, he was very persistent. And I think like a matter of weeks later, they end up getting married. So they get married in his church, and then they go back to Teresa's family house. And this is like literally within about the first hour of them getting home, someone says, "Do you want to see what you've married?" And Teresa says, "What do you mean, what I've married?" And this lady says, "Go over to the restroom and have a look." So gone to the toilet and had a look, banged on the door, and didn't answer. So she smashes the door down, and there's Johnny doing hardcore drugs with someone else, and she was absolutely livid. Anyway, Johnny comes out. His neck's in this huge fight ensues in the house. Police get called. They knew he'd just been married and just said to Teresa, "Get yourselves out of here right now. We won't press any charge. We won't arrest anyone, but just get him out of here." So they had this lovely hotel lined up where all the guests had basically chipped in together. There was a lovely hotel down the road, like $1,000 a night hotel back in them days. And instead, and this is in the words of Teresa, they ended up at this flea bag infested motel. And within about 5 minutes, Johnny grabbed the money from the wedding, grabbed the car keys, and said, "So I'll be back in a couple of minutes." Instead, went out and had obviously gone to go and get some drugs and do them with a load of people. In the meantime, hours are passing by, and Teresa's thinking, "Here I am, no money, no car keys, no nothing." These are the days before smartphones. So anyway, the next thing, in the morning, knock at the door, and she's thinking, "Oh, thank God, it's Johnny." It wasn't. It was Teresa's mother. And she says, "You need to come down to hospital." And she went, "What do you mean?" She says, and she started crying and said, "Johnny's been admitted dead on arrival, DOA." And she said, it can't be. What do you mean? She said, "We've got to go down and identify the body." So Teresa's crying, and the mother, they get down there and they get to the hospital. And in the meantime, at the very end of the corridor, they see this little guy in a white cloak, those hospital cloaks where if you don't do them up properly, your ass is hanging out the back. And this little guy sprints past, and it's Johnny Tapia. And Teresa's just like mouth open, and she's gone, "Is this some sort of sick joke or something?" To the mother, and the mother's like, "What is going on here?" So anyway, that was Teresa Tapia's first 24 hours as Miss Teresa Tapia instead of Miss Teresa Chavez. So yeah, I interviewed a lot of people for the book, and everything from what's his name, the guy from Sammy Hagar, who used to play for Van Halen. And I didn't even know he played for Van Halen. I thought I was just interviewing a boxing contact. So it was quite embarrassing when he's telling me I'm on tour at the moment in Thailand, and I'm thinking, doing what? And then I suddenly did a quick Google whilst you're in the interview, and I was thinking, shit, he's a big name. And But Sammy was good friends with Johnny, and Johnny had a big group of people who were close friends of his, but were like massive names. Another one being Mr. T, and he used to do corners for him and that. And Sammy Hagar was just another one who used to do corners. And Johnny's corner was unworkable to an extent. He just wanted people there so he could have a chat with them, literally during the fights. And there was once Johnny was asked a question, said something like, "Is it true that you've gone through 20 trainers in your career?" And he went, "No, no, no, sir, that's not true. It's nearer 35." And that was the truth. I think on 1 week once, he went through Freddie Roach, he went through Eddie Futch. I mean, people were coming in and out of his changing room like crazy. So, but what I loved about Johnny, and again, it's another shocking point, was the fact that he stopped boxing in 1990. Drugs, gangland warfare that he was involved in. He was out for 3.5 years, which is pretty much the same length of time which Muhammad Ali was out. And I make that comparison because Johnny was phenomenally talented, and yet he was a much smaller fighter, but the battles he was involved in were incredible. And he came back, and within something like 6 or 7 months of returning to professional boxing, after having been previously unbeaten at about 23 fights, something like that, he came back and he won the world title. He then went on to become a 3-weight world champion, 5-time world champion between coming and going. But all throughout that, there was one thing which he wasn't happy with. He had all the medals, all the trophies, all the belts he could ever dream of, and had been in with the very best and been in some absolute barn burner fights like Danny Romero and many others. But where the one fight he wasn't able to win was to do with his mother. And when he was 7 years old, this was the most hair-raising tale I was told. And when Teresa told him with extra detail, which went in the Ghost of Johnny Tapia book, that really made my hair stand on end. And what happened was he was about 7 years old, and one day he was told to stay around at his grandparents because his mum was going to go out and go to a dance hall. His mum loved dancing, and Johnny never had a problem with this, but on this particular day, he started crying and said, Mum, don't go. I've got a bad feeling about this." And she went, "Oh, don't be silly. Everything's going to be fine, Johnny." And he just didn't want to let it go of her. So she had a little trump card. She knew that one thing that Johnny would never refuse is chocolate. So she gave him a candy bar, and that sort of, got him off the trail. And then very spookily, exactly you'd see in a horror movie, in the middle of the night, Johnny suddenly woke up, looked out of his window, and as he looked out the window, he sees this big pickup truck, and strapped to the back with chains is this lady who he can see is in absolute distress. And the truck's gone past, and he sees it's his mum, and he starts screaming to his grandparents, "Just see mum, just see mum." He's explaining what she looked like at the back of this truck, and his grandparents had basically beat him up and then said, "You've had a bad dream, Johnny." Well, one day goes past, 2 days goes past, 3 days go past, no one knows where she is, and then they get a phone call to say she's in hospital, and she'd been stabbed 22 times with an ice pick and screwdriver, and raped. It was down a quarry. Somehow, after all that, she managed to crawl her way onto the road, and they were able to get an ambulance to take her to hospital. When she got to hospital, then the person who had committed the crimes went to the hospital and finished her off and banged her over the head with an iron bar. So Johnny's aim in life from the age of 7 was to find this person. Unfortunately, years later, when they did find this person, it turns out that they found that he died 10 years prior in a car crash. So he was never able to avenge that, and as a result, his mistress became drugs, and that unfortunately finished him off. He was dead on arrival in the end, 5 times at hospital. I don't think there's many people who've done that, and certainly not many people who have fought the way he has and generated the sort of attention and love in boxing he has. Frank Warren promoted him for a number of fights. I think the Danny Romero being one of them. And I remember Frank Warren telling me, he said there was gangland warfare problems with that fight, and so he decided to do a gun and knife amnesty before the fight, and expecting just maybe a few knives to appear, a little gun or something like that. And well, in the words of Frank Warren, he said the number of you gave a weapon and you got a free ticket to see the fight. That's how it worked. He said they filled up so many boxes of guns and knives. He says you literally had enough there to defend yourself in a war. He said, you know, we saw guns, machine guns, machetes, all sorts. And but they gave that up just so they could go and see Danny Romero fight against Johnny Tapia. And then Johnny Tapia won it. 7 years older, underdog, and took Romero to pieces. Romero was never the same again. So yeah, Johnny Tapia. There's a film. I think it's a HBO film on YouTube. If anyone's got the chance to see it, I think it's produced by 50 Cent. Certainly worth a look at. Again, that's one of the ones that will get the hair standing on the back of your neck.
Just want to point out two things that you mentioned in there. One, you said Johnny was a phenomenal fighter. Secondly, you said he was a lovable character. Johnny, through what he went through in his life, through bereavement, through addiction, through death himself, dying, like I say, 5 times before coming back to life. This is a man who should never really have amounted to anything in life, but he did, and he achieved so much success in the sport. How much of a fan favourite was he? And just very quickly, tell me about his visit to York Hall when he's come overseas to the UK and he's fought in York Hall.
As a fan favourite, I don't think you could find someone who was more of a fan favourite, to be honest. I mean, I'll weave straight into the second point there of York Hall. You know, we've both been to the York Hall. We've queued up for fights there. We've seen the popularity of the venue. It was the only fight he had off American soil. And when news had come that he was going to be fighting in the UK, the queue went round the block 3 times. Never been seen before. Never, ever, ever. And most people knew they weren't going to get tickets. Most of them had turned up with a bit of paper and a pen or a camera, just hoping to get a glance of Johnny. And I remember the headline that night was actually Wayne Alexander and being trained by Jimmy Tibbs. And I remember speaking to Wayne about it and saying, you know, what do you remember about Johnny that night? He said, well, I was a headline. He said, but I wasn't really. He said that at the press conferences, he says, I'd be there, you know, the main fight, the European title, which for the records, you know, Wayne blasted this guy out in 3 rounds, great fighter. But he said everyone's running over to Johnny Tapia. They wanted to get photos, they wanted to interview him. It was as if Wayne didn't exist. And it was almost like the equivalent of like Jake Paul, you know, sort of headlining Tyson Fury or something. You know, it made no sense. But Johnny went in there, and the reception he got literally took the roof off. And I interviewed his trainer for that fight, and he gave Johnny strict instructions. He said, "Listen, Johnny, you know, it's we're in United Kingdom here. It's a small hall. It's quite stuffy." He said, "But the fans have come here. They've travelled from all over the place to come in." He says, "Give them a bit of something, you know." He said, "Let it go for a few rounds." He said, "Then take this guy out if you want it." Okay. He said, "Yeah, cool." So his trainer was a bit of an elderly guy, and he slowly sort of like the bell went, and he's slowly coming down the steps, and then he's just about got his arse on the seat. And by the time he sat down, ding ding, the fight was over. That was it. I think it was 1 minute and 16 seconds, and Johnny was doing his back flips, and he was helping his opponent off the floor, and going around and talking to everyone, and that was just Johnny. And anyone who ever met Johnny Tapia was absolutely in love with the man. I think the only thing that they will all agree with as well, though, is that he was possibly the most troubled individual to ever walk the face of this planet. Very few people had the mental demons he did, and to have been able to continue the way he did, what was incredible. There is a part which you do wonder, if it wasn't for the fact that he was on a suicide mission his whole life, would he have taken so many risks in the ring? I'm not sure. Certainly, I think it made him more fearless. But what people don't realise about Johnny Tapia is what an incredibly gifted fighter he was. He had shades of Sugar Ray Robinson about him with his footwork, his hand speed, the repetition of punches he could throw, but also his toughness. He could stand there and trade, and he had a chin of granite on him as well. So, yeah, phenomenally talented fighter, crowd pleaser beyond belief. Will we ever see another Johnny Tapia? I doubt it.
Absolutely, I doubt it too. Paul, thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you very much, James, and look forward to speaking soon.